The pen was already uncapped when I felt it, that tight warning pressure in my chest that never shows up without a reason. Sunlight spilled across my kitchen table, catching the edge of a stack of papers that didn't belong there, and suddenly my home felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in. This was supposed to be the morning after my granddaughter's wedding. Calm, safe, ordinary. If you're listening to this and you've ever had a moment where everything looked right but felt dangerously wrong, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because stories like this don't happen in isolation. I remember the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the way everyone was smiling too easily, how politeness hung heavier than fear. I knew then that whatever was about to happen wouldn't come with shouting or threats. It would come softly, legally, with ink. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I just stepped forward, knowing that one sentence could either cost us everything or save it. That was the moment everything began to unravel. I almost ruined my granddaughter's wedding before it ever truly began. Not with anger, not with jealousy, but with one quiet sentence I never planned to say out loud. That morning, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Soft light, white fabric, calm smiles. From the outside, it was perfect. Inside my chest, something was tightening with every breath. I've learned to pay attention to that feeling. It doesn't shout, it presses. I stood there as more than a grandmother. I was the woman who raised her when the world felt unsafe, the one who learned, over decades, that danger rarely arrives loudly. It arrives polite, organized, smiling. Watching her prepare for marriage, I felt pride and fear tangled together. Weddings soften people. They make approval feel urgent. They teach you to ignore the small signals in your body so everyone else stays comfortable. That's when mistakes happen. I didn't want to interfere. I wanted to protect. There's a difference, even if it doesn't look that way from the outside. What I said next would sound cruel without context, controlling without history, but experience has taught me this. When something feels wrong in a room that looks right, you don't wait for proof. You listen. And before you judge what came next, you need to understand. I listen. I raised my granddaughter on my own. There was no backup plan, no one stepping in when I was tired or afraid. It was just the two of us, moving through life quietly, doing what needed to be done. Responsibility has a way of sharpening you when there's no room to fall apart. You learn to stay steady even when your hands are shaking. I worked long hours and came home tired, but I learned early that fear spreads faster than calm. So I carried mine silently, over time. That kind of life teaches you to notice things other people don't. Not dramatic things, small ones. The way a smile lingers a second too long, the way a voice softens when someone wants compliance, the way help sometimes arrives with strings attached. Hardship doesn't make you suspicious. It makes you observant. You stop taking reassurance at face value. You start trusting what your body tells you before your mind catches up. I learned that danger rarely announces itself. It doesn't slam doors or raise voices. More often, it shows up organized, polite, and confident that no one will challenge it. Years ago, I learned the hard way what happens when you trust the wrong calm. I learned how easy it is to sign something when you're tired, grieving, or just trying to keep the peace. Paper can look harmless, language can sound protective, and once control slips, getting it back costs more than anyone tells you. Weddings, I've noticed, make people softer. They make approval feel urgent. They teach young women to smooth edges and ignore instincts so nothing feels awkward. That's when people who wait quietly step forward. So when my granddaughter got engaged, I didn't just celebrate, I watched. And when I finally met the family she was marrying into, I understood why my instincts had started speaking again. During the engagement, everyone around us fell in love with his family almost immediately. They were polished in a way people admire without questioning. Dinners were orderly. Conversations flowed smoothly. There was always a sense that everything was handled. Friends told me how lucky my granddaughter was to be marrying into such a solid, respectable family. I nodded along, because on the surface, they gave no reason not to be admired. His mother stood at the center of it all. She was warm, attentive, and unfailingly polite. Compliments came easily from her, but they landed with weight. Praise was often paired with assessment, as if she were quietly taking notes. I noticed how she touched my granddaughter's arm when she spoke, how she guided conversations without raising her voice. Nothing about it was rude. That was the problem. It all felt intentional, carefully measured. The men followed her rhythm. Her husband stayed close, agreeing without adding much of his own. His silence didn't feel shy. It felt practiced. Their sons mirrored it in different ways. One was agreeable to a fault, always stepping back rather than forward. The other treated family gatherings like something to observe rather than participate in. No one argued, no one disrupted the flow. Certain words came up often. Standards, organization, responsibility. They were spoken gently, almost lovingly, but they carried an edge. Each time I heard them, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. The family didn't feel chaotic or cruel. They felt managed, like a system that worked because everyone knew their role. Others saw harmony. I saw choreography. The more flawless they appeared, the more certain I became that this perfection required maintenance. Families don't move that smoothly by accident. Someone is always steering. I couldn't have explained it clearly then. I only knew the feeling was old, familiar. And as I watched them smile and settle into place around my granddaughter, a memory I hadn't visited in years began to stir, reminding me why politeness has never made me feel safe. Watching that family move so smoothly stirred a memory I rarely allow myself to revisit. It comes from a time when my life was quieter on the outside and completely unraveled underneath. I was grieving then, exhausted in a way sleep never touches, responsible for a child while trying to understand a loss that had hollowed me out. During that period, help arrived. It didn't rush in or demand attention. It sat at my kitchen table with a calm voice and a sympathetic smile. I remember feeling relieved more than cautious. When you're tired enough, relief feels like safety. Papers were placed in front of me, described as routine, protective, temporary. I was told not to worry about details, that everything could be explained later. I wanted the noise in my head to stop, and signing felt easier than questioning. Weeks passed before I realized how much control I had almost handed away. A professional finally read what I hadn't. She didn't raise her voice or scold me. She simply showed me the language I'd overlooked, the phrases that sounded helpful but carried no ending. Temporary had no expiration. Protection meant access. Undoing that mistake took months of fear, paperwork, and the constant dread that I had nearly lost the little stability I was trying to preserve. That was the moment I learned something that never left me. Harm doesn't always come wrapped in anger. Sometimes it arrives organized, patient, and polite. It relies on your manners. It counts on your exhaustion. It uses paper instead of force. So when I hear gentle voices asking for signatures or reassurance framed as responsibility, my body remembers before my mind does. That memory is why I guard what matters quietly now. It's why I learned that secrecy, when chosen carefully, can be an act of protection. There was something my granddaughter didn't fully understand for most of her life, and that was by design. We never lived lavishly. There were no outward signs that would draw attention. What we had was quiet, ordinary, and intentionally invisible. That invisibility was the protection. Years before she was born, there was land tied to our family, nothing anyone would slow down to admire, but beneath it were agreements, long-term arrangements that accumulated value slowly and steadily, no sudden windfalls, no announcements, just consistency over time. When the reality of it finally settled in for me, I didn't celebrate. I locked the documents away and sat alone until my breathing evened out. From the beginning, I understood that wealth without noise disappears just as quietly if you aren't careful. So a trust was created, not as a gift, but as a boundary. It was layered, dull, and restrictive on purpose. It existed to prevent access, not invite it. My granddaughter was allowed to live an ordinary life because ordinary keeps you safe. When people think you are average, they don't plan around you. The trust wasn't a reward waiting for her. It was a line that protected what had taken generations to hold on to, and it came with one rule I never broke. No one outside the family needed to know, not friends, not neighbors, and especially not future in-laws. Marriage has a way of making people feel entitled to doors that were never theirs to open. Silence was how control was maintained. Once information is spoken, it can't be taken back. And as the wedding grew closer, I began to realize that the quiet I had kept for so long might soon become a risk of its own. That was when I knew I would have to speak, even if it frightened her. I chose my moment carefully, or at least I thought I did, 2 days before the wedding. She sat across from me on the couch, hair pinned, eyes tired in that quiet way brides get when everyone has been pulling at them. The room smelled like pressed fabric and flowers that had arrived too early. Nothing was wrong. That's what made it hard. I hesitated because love makes you gentle, and fear can sound like control if you're not careful. I didn't want to scare her. I wanted to prepare her. So I spoke plainly, without drama, and told her that marriage changes more than a last name. It changes what people feel entitled to ask for. It makes some people bolder and others quieter, and both can be dangerous. I explained that there were things in her life that needed to stay private, not out of secrecy, but out of protection. I told her never to mention certain matters to her husband's family, not casually, not reassuringly, not even as a joke. I framed it as a boundary, not a suspicion. She listened, but I could feel her resistance. Weddings teach young women to keep the peace, to trust smiles, to believe that organization is the same as care. She wanted to believe the best. I recognized that look because I once wore it myself. I reminded her that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's a locked door. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between control and surrender. She nodded, squeezed my hand, and promised she understood. I wanted to believe that was enough. But as she stood to leave, already pulled back into wedding plans and messages, I felt the weight of uncertainty. Warnings don't always land when hearts are full, and I didn't know yet if mine. The morning after the wedding felt almost kind. She came by early, shoes in her hand, hair loosely tied back, carrying that soft glow people have before reality settles in. We sat at my kitchen table with coffee and eggs, the kind of ordinary breakfast that convinces you everything has landed safely. For a moment, I let myself breathe. But calm doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's just quiet before movement. I watched her closely, the way her smile stayed in place a second too long, the way she pushed food around her plate without finishing it. Her phone buzzed once, then again, face down on the table. She brushed it off gently, explaining enthusiasm, family excitement. Nothing unusual. I didn't correct her. I paid attention. I noticed how her shoulders tightened each time the phone vibrated, how her laugh came a beat late. Bodies often react before minds catch up. Mine certainly does. That old pressure settled behind my ribs again, the one that never lies to me. I reminded her of what we'd talked about carefully, without urgency. She nodded quickly, reassuring me without quite meeting my eyes. She told me she hadn't shared anything she shouldn't have. I wanted to believe her. I almost did. The house felt too still, like it was holding its breath. The clock ticked louder than usual. Outside, a car door closed. I stood up without realizing it, already moving toward the front of the house. Then the doorbell rang. Not casually, not uncertainly. It rang with confidence, the kind that assumes it will be answered, and before my hand reached the knob, I knew the calm was over. They didn't wait to be invited in. The door had barely opened before the space shifted, like the house itself had lost ownership. His parents stepped through first, calm and certain, already explaining how they'd been nearby, how this would only take a moment. Behind them came their sons, positioned without thought or apology, filling the room with familiarity that hadn't been earned. And then there was the man I didn't recognize. He carried a leather folder, held neatly against his chest, and moved with professional ease. He wasn't family. He wasn't here to celebrate. He stood quietly near the table, already surveying where he would set things down. That was when I understood. This wasn't a visit, it was an appointment. The kitchen that had felt safe minutes earlier now felt staged. Chairs were subtly blocked, corners filled. My granddaughter was guided toward the table without being touched, just steered by proximity and expectation. Politeness did the work force never could. The folder opened. Papers were placed carefully, aligned, smoothed flat as if neatness could make them harmless. Everything was framed as routine, responsible. Something families like theirs simply did. There was no explanation offered, just reassurance. No urgency spoken aloud, only implied by the presence of a pen already uncapped. I watched her hesitate, not because she wanted to sign, but because she had been taught that refusal creates discomfort. Her hand hovered, pulled forward by smiles and softened voices, by the idea that starting a marriage with resistance was somehow wrong. I tracked everything. Who stood closest? Who stayed silent? Who never looked at her face? This wasn't discussion. It was choreography. Every person knew their role except the one being cornered. The pen rested on the paper like a loaded thing. 5 minutes, maybe less. And control could shift quietly, legally, permanently. No raised voices, no threats, just pressure wrapped in courtesy. My chest tightened the way it does when something irreversible is seconds away. I had seen this before. I knew how quickly a signature could rewrite a life. And as I watched her fingers inch closer to that pen, I realized there was no more time for observation. Silence had done its job. Now it was my turn to speak. The room went still before I moved, not the calm kind of stillness, but the kind that waits for something to happen. I stepped forward just enough to be seen, my voice steady, my body quiet. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my tone. I simply interrupted the momentum. I focused on the man with the folder, not the family. Professionals listen when questions are clear. I asked which trust the paperwork referred to, already knowing the answer. The pause that followed was small, but it mattered. He hesitated just long enough to break the rhythm they'd built. That hesitation changed everything. As the papers were checked again, more carefully this time, the air shifted. Confidence drained from the room without a sound. The neat certainty that had carried them in faltered as details were read instead of assumed. Lines that had been skimmed before now demanded attention. That was when I said the sentence that ended it. I explained that the trust they were trying to access no longer existed in the form they believed. It had already been restructured, quietly, legally, with intention. Marriage had triggered changes they hadn't accounted for, and those changes were designed to do one thing: protect. The confirmation came slowly, line by line. Pressure invalidated claims. Spouses and in-laws were excluded. Any attempt to rush or coerce removed standing altogether. The pen was lifted from the table without ceremony. No one argued. There was nothing to argue with. The power that had filled the room moments earlier had nowhere to go. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. Preparation had done what confrontation never could. And as the silence returned, I knew the danger had passed, even if the consequences were only beginning to surface. After they left, the house felt unfamiliar for a moment, like a place that had been held too tightly and was only just breathing again. No one spoke right away. The air settled on its own, heavier with understanding than fear. I watched my granddaughter closely. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She stood still, shoulders squared, eyes clear in a way I hadn't seen before. When she finally moved, it was with intention, not hesitation. She thanked the man who had come with the papers, calmly and directly, and then made it clear the matter was over. There was no anger in her voice. There didn't need to be. What struck me most was what she didn't do. She didn't look for permission. She didn't soften her words to make anyone comfortable. The politeness that had nearly cornered her was gone, replaced by something steadier. Awareness had taken its place. Her husband stayed quiet. I noticed that too. Silence can mean many things, but in that moment, it revealed more than any argument could have. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be understood. The others gathered themselves quickly, movements tighter than when they arrived. Confidence had drained away. Leaving frustration, they tried to hide behind efficiency. When the door closed behind them, the house felt like it belonged to us again. My granddaughter stood in the middle of the room, breathing slowly, as if seeing the space differently now, not because it had changed, but because she had. I realized then that she hadn't just avoided a mistake. She had crossed a line into self-possession. What happened that morning wasn't about money or paper. It was about boundaries and marriage. I was learning. It doesn't just change relationships, it reveals them. People talk about marriage as if it only changes two lives. What I've learned is that it changes the room around those two people. Once vows are spoken, some individuals stop seeing a couple as separate adults and start seeing access. Doors they never touched before suddenly feel unlocked. Marriage doesn't create entitlement, but it reveals it. It makes certain people bolder in what they ask for and quieter in how they take. Politeness becomes a tool. Responsibility becomes a reason, and pressure often hides behind concern, especially when everyone wants things to stay pleasant. Young women are especially vulnerable during that shift. Weddings teach them to be gracious, to smooth tension, to prove they belong. They are praised for being agreeable long before they are encouraged to be protected. In moments of transition, the desire to keep the peace can outweigh the instinct to ask questions. That's when boundaries matter most. I used to think silence meant fear. Experience taught me otherwise. Silence can be strategy. It can be a pause that allows truth to surface before damage is done. Not every boundary needs an explanation. Not every concern needs to be announced. Sometimes the strongest choice is the one made quietly, long before anyone realizes a line existed. Boundaries aren't rejection. They're responsibility. They protect relationships that are meant to last by keeping others from claiming space that was never offered. Love doesn't require surrender, and family doesn't earn access simply by standing close. What happened in my living room wasn't unique to us. I've seen versions of it play out in different forms, in different families, always wrapped in good intentions and polite language. That's why this story matters beyond one wedding morning, because when you understand what marriage really changes, you stop confusing kindness with compliance. And as I looked back at my granddaughter that day, I knew the most important part of the story wasn't over yet. After everything settled, I locked the front door and stood in the quiet of my living room for a long moment. The house felt like itself again. I went to the cabinet where I keep old documents and handwritten reminders, placed the folder back inside, and turned the key. The sound was soft, final, and comforting. Nothing had been taken from us that day. Something had been returned. Clarity. Agency. The understanding that protection doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation. Sometimes it looks like knowing when to stay silent and when not to. My granddaughter stood nearby, watching without asking questions. She didn't need answers anymore. She had gained something far more valuable than reassurance. She had learned that her life doesn't become public property just because she loves someone, that marriage doesn't erase boundaries. It makes them necessary. People often mistake silence for weakness. I've lived long enough to know better. Silence, when chosen, can be a lock. It can keep predators out and peace intact. It can give you time to see people clearly before they reach too far. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. Truly. I share it because these moments are more common than we admit, and awareness is how we protect each other. Take a moment and think about where you might be rushing yourself to keep the peace. And if you've ever felt pressured to agree, sign, or stay quiet when something felt wrong, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read.